Alright, so here we have the Unity engine interface kind of in its default layout. Now this is something you're going to get pretty familiar with as you continue down your game development journey, but just to give you a quick overview of the windows that you're seeing here and their function. So our assets, or our project folder, which contains our assets, project window, sorry, down here is what you will content that you will import into the engine. So anything you bring into the engine, images or 3D models or sound files, will get imported into your assets folder. And if we actually look back at our project, you can see inside of our project folder in Windows, there is an assets folder, and inside of that is scenes. This is a mirror of the content here. So if you're importing something, you can drag and drop it into this window and Unity will copy it into your Windows directory. Or you can modify things in Windows, such as making a new folder. Let's call this one scripts. And when you jump back over to Unity, now you have a scripts folder. So Unity is very flexible in how it works with assets, and it's very friendly to that workflow of updating things as you're going, importing and duplicating content and things like that. And the Unreal Engine is way more restrictive about working with content, so it's kind of a nice way to work inside Unity. So your project folder is here. Now next to it, docked, kind of hidden behind, is your console. This is where any script errors or messages will pop up. So one thing I automatically do when I'm working in Unity is grab this window, just click and drag it, and I dock it somewhere else. I like it over here if I have this default layout. That way I can see it. It's really common if something's gone wrong in your game that this will spew out a bunch of red errors, whether they're null references or exceptions, and you will easily ignore them if this window is hidden. They're harder to ignore if it's right here, so I like to keep this visible. So right above the project window is the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is everything that's contained within your scene. Now a scene in Unity, kind of think of it as a level in a game. It's a collection of content that you've created either by dragging and dropping things in from your project, or you've created game objects inside of the scene hierarchy here, and you've built out your level, including, you know, maybe your player character and enemies and obstacles and power-ups and things like that. So in the hierarchy, you can click on these objects. These are the default objects that Unity's created, and by clicking on them, you can see them selecting over here in your scene view, and you can also see all of their properties over here in your inspector. So your scene view, as you've probably guessed, is your kind of window into the game world that lets you edit, click on things, move them around, and perform the sort of functions of editing your scene. And editing individual objects is done over here in the inspector. So whether it's your objects that you've selected here, or even objects you've selected in your assets, the options, editing options, will pop up inside the inspector, and you can modify things. So this directional light right here, I could change the intensity of. It's not really doing anything visible right now because we don't have anything in the scene, but that's how you go about doing that. Now there's another window that's kind of hidden, a couple of them actually. There's the game window and the asset store. Asset store you don't need to worry about just yet. It's a place where you can purchase or find free content to help you build your game. But the game window is pretty important, and this is your view, the player's view, I should say, into your game world. So if you click on your scene window here, and then you click on your main camera, notice how when it's selected, I have this, these lines to indicate what it's seeing. I also have a little preview. That preview is basically the same thing as your game window. And again, I like this to be up while I'm working, usually. So I grab this and click and drag it, put it next to the other window. So that's pretty useful to have both of these up at the same time. Okay, so this is the basic interface. Now I'm going to show you how to manipulate things in the scene, and then also how to navigate the scene, since getting around in your scene is kind of important. So firstly, manipulating things, if you click on an object, you can see your standard translation gizmo here, RGB for red, green, and blue, or X, Y, and Z. In Unity, X and Z are the axes that lay flat on the ground, and Y is up. This might be different if you're using a different program. Usually this is the sort of standard convention though. You can click and drag on any of these and move your object around. So I'm moving my camera. It's not really showing anything over here because there's nothing in the scene yet, but once we add some stuff, you'll be able to see that work. And clicking between them is helpful. You can move it along these two planes. So if I undo a couple things, this could be helpful on, dragging things on a flat ground is pretty handy with that. Now some hotkeys and options for changing the gizmos are Q, W, E, and R, and this is the same as Maya if you're familiar with that program. So these hotkeys toggle between movement, rotation, and scale. And then Unity also has a rect tool, which I'll get into a little bit in the future. Now scaling our camera isn't really going to do anything since it's just looking into the scene, but rotating it will. And you can see a little bit of rotation happening there, a little bit more if we do it on the x-axis here. So rotation is useful. Sometimes it's useful to have a local rotation, and sometimes it's useful to have a global rotation. So this is especially useful if you have a spotlight or a light source and you want to rotate it around the global axis. This can be done by toggling up here in the top left, local to global, and then you can rotate it around. You can see the background changing a little bit. Skybox. Okay, cool. So that's how you manipulate objects in the scene. There's one other useful thing to do, and that is framing an object, and that's done with the F key. So I'm going to hit F to frame this camera, and I can zoom in with scroll wheel and zoom out with scroll wheel. And then I can also orbit around an object by holding down Alt and left clicking. So this is a useful way to work. If you select something maybe in the hierarchy, you press F to frame it up, zoom in a little bit, and then you can rotate around. You can also use first-person shooter controls to navigate. If you hold down right-click, you have the ability to look around, and then you can press W to move forward, and S to move back. A and D is going to strafe left and right, and then Q and E just above is going to kind of move you up and down vertically. So you can kind of get around by pressing F, orbiting, zooming, and then sliding around with those controls. If you wanted to use this gizmo up in your scene view to quickly swap between different orientations, you can do that as well. You can also swap between perspective and orthographic projection. Okay, so let's dive now into what these components, game objects we should call them, are that have been created, and how Unity operates. So Unity is an engine that's built on, certain conventions. Unreal is the same way. And the certain, terminology for things inside the engine is kind of specific to Unity. So what Unity calls a fundamental thing is a game object. So each of these things inside of my scene, whether it's a camera or a directional light, these are both game objects. And I can create new game objects by clicking the Create menu in the hierarchy. And I have the option to create empty, create a 3D object, create another light, maybe another camera, or some, UI elements or particle effects or something like that. So Unity's created a sort of some preset things for you to work with. You're probably going to modify and change these things as you kind of get better with the engine, but this is often a good place to start, and having these options here is definitely useful. So I'm going to go and create a cube in the 3D object option, and it's dropped it into the scene. So it's created a new game object, called it cube, and over here on the right you can see in the inspector it has created it with a bunch of properties, and these properties will change things like the position via the transform component here. The mesh renderer will change what is displaying and how it's displaying. You can toggle this on and off to see or hide the object. And then it has also got collision on it by default. So this box collider, you can see here in the scene view, there's a thin green border that disappears when I toggle this on and off. So here's my newly created game object, and by default Unity will create it just in the center of where the camera is looking. So a common thing to do in Unity is actually to zero out the transform of an object just to reset it back to the origin. So I'm going to take the position and plug in 0, 0, 0, 0, and that's going to put it, you can see here, just in the center of the grid. And then because it's in the center vertically, I might want to move it up by, say, 0.5. This is 1 unit cube, so 0.5 is going to put it flat on the ground. Now there isn't actually any ground here, so what we might want to do is add some type of ground, and for that we can go to create again and add a plane. And again, the plane has been created in the center of the camera view, which is now at 0.5, so I'm going to zero this back out. And now we have a cube that is sitting on the ground, and we can see certain things that we couldn't before, like our main camera is now showing a little more interesting view into the world. We can adjust the position of the main camera. You can see the game view updating over there on that screen. You can also adjust the light, so rotating on the global rotation, you can see shadows moving around the object. Okay, so let's position a couple things around. Let's move our camera back to the origin here. We can put 0 in the X, and I'm going to move it up to 2, and then I'm going to plug in -10 just to move it back a little bit. So the first important thing to know about Unity is that everything in the scene here is a game object. At the most fundamental level, each thing is an empty game object, and it's been imbued with different abilities and functionality by the components that are attached to it. So what I just did was create an empty game object. Here's another one. And an empty game object just has the kind of basic features of what a game object needs to have. And that is a transform component. So it has a position in space, as you can see here, because it has a gizmo. And it has a name, obviously, and a tag, and a layer, and then some other properties as well. So at the root, each of these objects, although they have different properties and function in the world, they all are game objects. And if you want to change the properties or ability of a game object, all you need to do is change which components are attached. So each element here inside of the inspector, this mesh filter, the mesh renderer, the box collider, each of these is a component, and you can add more components by just clicking the Add Component button and then navigating through Unity's list of pre-built components. Now Unity has gone pretty far into creating components that are going to be useful to you in your kind of quest to create gameplay. So you can do a lot with the components that Unity has given you, but of course every game is different, and you're going to want to create additional components by creating scripts and attaching those to game objects to give the features of your game different abilities and different functions. So my directional light right here is a light because it has a light component attached. So on my empty game object, if I was to go add component, type in light, now I have another light. And this is a different type of light. It's a point light, so you can see it emitting and illuminating kind of a circle of light here. I can change the light type to a directional light and rotate it. Maybe it's a little bit bright, so I can adjust the brightness down. But you can see here now that there are two light sources in the scene. And if I wanted to remove this object, this light from the game, I could delete this game object, or I could just simply right-click on the component here and click Remove Component. And that's going to remove that illumination from the world. So the same with all of these. A cube is a cube because it has a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, and a box collider. These are the components that Unity has set up by default. But you can create a cube from scratch if you duplicated that set of components. So a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, and I don't even need to have a collider if I just want a mesh to display. I am going to need something in the mesh here, and I can click on this little target over here to see what's currently in the project. These are just the default objects. If you had more models imported, you would see a big list, and you could drag and drop things from your project as well. So I can create a sphere by clicking here, and it's going to create a sphere. Now it's showing up as bright, kind of a magenta color, because it doesn't have a material attached. So Unity, by going through the create menu, has already sort of preset some things, but I can add a default material if I wanted to, default material here, and now it will properly render. And while we're doing this, let's create a material. So a material is a useful thing to know about. It specifies how something looks inside of the scene. So a material is created inside of your project. It's actually an asset, but it's not something you're going to necessarily import. It's something that you can create and add in the create menu of your project window instead of your hierarchy. So I'm going to right click down here and create a folder and name this materials. And then inside my material, so just double clicking on that, I'm going to right click again, or I can go to the create menu here, same option, and choose material. And let's call this material player. And like I said, the inspector is going to show us properties of objects which are selected, regardless of whether they are in the hierarchy here or whether they're in the project. If there are editing options, then the inspector is going to show them. And I can adjust different material properties by adjusting things here. But first, let's add this material to an object in the scene. I can do that a couple different ways. I can drag and drop it onto an object, or I can select the object that I want and then drag and drop it into, for instance, into this mesh render, into the material spot right here. You might need to expand it. I can drag and drop this material right here. Now it doesn't look very different, but if I go back to the player and I click on this little color picker link here, I can adjust the color, and it is updating because this material has been assigned to this game object and to the mesh renderer component. It is updating that object. If I had this material on other objects, such as on this floor or on the cube, they would also update. So that's one of the lessons working with Unity as well, is that if you have objects or assets that are set up inside of your project, if you change those, modify them, and they're used in multiple places, then all of those things are going to change. Both the floor and the ball are changing color. So those are some of the basics of working with the engine. We covered how to navigate through the different windows and how to create game objects, and then also how to give functionality to those game objects by adding components. So in the next video, we are going to create some simple gameplay behaviors and move this sphere around using the physics engine of Unity.